Okay, hello, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back again. Yeah, so thank you again to Motoko for and for all this. Again, I'm so happy to be here. I just feel like I need to say that every possible time. So I wanted to talk to you today about well, actually, when I received the invitation to come here, I began thinking, well, what can I say that might be interesting? About 10 years ago, I was going to a lot of translation studies conferences, and talking about translation all the time. But I realized that, of course, translation is everywhere. It enables all aspects of our contemporary life. It's so fundamental to the way that we exist in the world. But when I came back from my conferences, all excited, talking about the things that I had learned and experienced, I found that I had lots of trouble talking to my colleagues about the things that I had been presenting about and so on. I think that the study of translation, especially in Anglophone North America, where I live, exists in a really kind of strange, awkward place that doesn't fall squarely within, any particular department. For instance, in my department is a world languages and literatures department. So everyone I work with immediately around me, understands the importance of translation. So I'm in a very lucky community. But immediately when I go and begin talking about translation studies to my colleagues in the English department, I can see that they quickly glaze over. And part of that is that they necessarily don't speak, other languages and have difficult time following some of the small details, the things we want to talk about. So, I mean, I realize that translation studies sometimes has difficulty capturing broad audiences because so many of the arguments, so many of the things that we talk about rely upon so many small linguistic tiny details that are difficult for people to understand, especially if they only speak one language. This got me thinking. I was thinking about this, and I remembered a really interesting book that was published by Koyano Atsushi some years ago. Those of you who recognize his name know that he's a bit of a provocateur in Japanese literature studies. He kind of makes inflammatory, statements to get conversations going. And at the beginning of this actually quite wonderful book, he makes one of those statements. He says, "It seems to me that the strangely neurotic debates about translation are rather like those arguments that audiophiles used to have a generation ago about which components make records sound best. Basically, just a kind of mania. Of course, translations full of mistakes are ones that are hard to read or a problem, but people who can read the original themselves don't really need to make such a fuss about mistranslations or awkward phrasing." So, he's saying, his argument basically is that there are other ways to do translation studies, rather than just kind of focus on small details that are difficult for people to understand. His goal is to refocus the attention on individual translators, to look at the lives of translators, see what they're doing, and approach translation studies that way, and create a very new kind of accessible translation studies that will be open to everybody and very interesting to everybody. I don't agree with him 100% because I love the small details. As a translator myself, I'm always thinking about small details. And I feel that small details are where all of our arguments come from. But I understand his point that it's helpful to make translation studies accessible by presenting translation as not just linguistic fiddling, but also a kind of human-centered translation history. Presenting translation studies as a form of cultural history is actually very useful to us in our field. And I think that actually makes sense. Is looking at the questions of who did translation, why, how, when, those produce some really fascinating kinds of studies that are very approachable to other people. He also encouraged us to think about how those translations shift cultural trends. So very useful things. So the main point here is that a human focus, like we have here in our wonderful conference, makes translation studies a very vibrant and accessible form of cultural history, especially when we showcase the work of the individuals driving literary and cultural development. I think that's no surprise to anyone here in this room. But something I think that's worth, considering as we try to think about how to make our field attractive to other people. Sorry. So I wanted to add also in one other observation that can help us think about translation studies in the way that it can be an interesting form of cultural history. I think probably everybody in this room has read this very, very famous book by Lawrence Venuti called The Translation Scandals of Translation. He argues that not only can we think about the human aspect of translation, but he argues that translation is a kind of process of identity formation that's double-edged. Translation constructs a domestic representation of a foreign text and culture, but at the same time, it constructs a domestic subject, a position of intelligibility that is also an ideological position informed by the codes and canons, interests, and agendas of certain domestic social groups. In other words, what he's saying is that when we look at uh, translations, the translations are always made for the receiving target culture. So when we look at what is translated and when, that gives us a way to see what is valuable to the target culture. So this also allows us, we usually think about translation as giving us a window into the source culture, but also it gives us a very valuable window into the receiving culture as well. And to me, when I first read that, in 1990s, that was a very, very new thought to me, and but one that's influenced my thinking ever since. Translators are one of the things we can take away from this is that translators are human actors performing important historical work while negotiating cultures, introducing, presenting ideas, and potentially shifting ideological horizons. So by looking at translations, when they're done, how they're received, we understand a lot about the receiving culture too. So the implication of this is that translated literature is a huge field, obviously, but scholars of national literatures, such as scholars of Japanese literature like myself, rarely, look into these kind of things. But by kind of looking at what things were translated, how and when, it has the possibility of teaching us many things about the ways that individuals, as well as their societies, have thought about and interacted with, and even negotiated culture. So if we tear back the surface of the text, we immediately see history lying underneath. That's the reason for the picture there. So I thought I would give you a couple of case studies, looking at some different things that I've seen over the years to show some of the kind of interesting things that translation can reveal about history. So the first case study I'd like to present is one of the translation of the very famous novel by Jules Verne, Autour du monde en 80 jours. Le Tour du Monde en 80 jours, Around the World in 80 Days, which was published in 1872 and was translated into Japanese in two parts, the first one in 1878 and the second part in 1880. This was a hugely enormous bestseller in Japan at the time that it was translated. It was the first book of literature ever to be translated directly from French into Japanese, and it became a massive bestseller. When I realized this, I was very intrigued because I loved this book as a little boy. And so one of the reasons I looked into this so deeply was because it was very natsukashi to look back to me, for me to look back at this text. So I want to share a few things about the history of the translation of this text and to talk about what it can teach us. So there's a picture of a very handsome Jules Verne over there, and here's a picture of the very handsome translator of him into Japanese, a fellow by the name of Kawashima Chunosuke. I'll just say a few words about who he was. Kawashima Chunosuke is not a famous person, especially. He only translated this one book that we know of. But because this is the first book ever translated from French literature into Japanese, it's quite important and so therefore worthy of attention. He learned French while he was a student in Yokosuka. He was working at a steel production company, which had been created at the shogunate's recommendation before the Meiji Restoration. It was created with the help of a French engineer by the name of François Léonce Verny. In 1872, he joined the Ministry of the Navy. The following year, he began working as an interpreter for the French engineers at the Tomioka Silk Mill, which you may know has been inscribed, I think, in the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So he's actually, this gentleman hopped around to a bunch of places that were very, very important in Japanese industrial history. In 1876 to 77, he traveled to Europe with businessmen who were wanting to sell silkworm paper in Italy. So this was his first trip abroad. And the way that he went abroad was he sailed across the Pacific to America, took a train across to America, and then sailed across the Atlantic to get to Europe. So in the course of his, oh, here's a photograph of him, one of the rare photographs of him that actually exists. And you'll see the second figure from the left is Shibusawa Eiichi, who's a very important figure in Japanese business history. If you know something about economic history, that's a name you'll absolutely will recognize. Anyway, it's said that he received the first copy of the Jules Verne novel from his cousin, who was a businessman from Mitsui, and also the future French ambassador, Nakajima Saichi, who sent him the original book in French from Paris. But we also know that while traveling across the United States by train in 1876, he bought an English translation at a train station and apparently to look at in the train. It seems that in the translation I'm about to talk about, that he may have referred to the American translation as well, because there are differences between the American version and the French version, and some of the differences are reflected actually in the Japanese text. Later on in the future, he went to work in Lyon, and after that, he never returned to translation again, which is a shame because this translation is truly extraordinary. In the Meiji period, there's many translations, of course, but many translations are just more like what we would call in modern Japanese hongan. They kind of pick up the main ideas and kind of, leave things out that maybe are not so central to the story, or they add something in to make the story seem better, but Kawashima's translation is remarkable in that it is very, very close, almost line for line, almost sentence for sentence to the original Japanese. So it's not only important as a historical marker, in the translation history, but also shows a remarkable level of fidelity to the original. By the way, I should just also point out, this is one of the first wave of post-Meiji Restoration translations, the first one ever translated from French directly into Japanese. Kawashima commented that it was to contribute to social enlightenment, and he published it with a publisher at what would later become Keio University. And this press was headed by one of Fukuzawa Yukichi's students. So Fukuzawa Yukichi, I think we all know, is one of the major figures in promoting Western learning in Japan. So again, we can see that this entire project of publishing this book was designed to increase Japanese knowledge about the outside world. Now, the reason that it appealed and became a bestseller was that it was so fun. It's such a fun story, but at the same time, it teaches us a lot about the geography of the outside world, which to the Japanese of 1878 was still a new subject. Learning about the world was still new. The Meiji Restoration had only happened 10 years ago. So this book, which talks about all the differences that the characters experience as they travel around the world, provided a fun tour of the world in the form of a story. This book was so popular that it inaugurated a boom of Jules Verne translations that made him one of the best-known European writers in Meiji Japan. Very quickly, there was 1 or 2 Jules Verne translations every year for the next, 20 years. Done by many prominent translators such as Inoue Tsutomu and Morita Shiken. Two very enormous translators. Those two, by the way, Inoue Tsutomu and Morita Shiken, worked from English translations of Jules Verne into Japanese. Anyway, I obviously don't have a lot of time, so I just want to look at a couple of parts of this book. But one of the parts that I think is especially interesting to look at is the part where the characters in the book go to Japan, and they go to Yokohama, the very same town where Kawashima himself lived. So here are some pictures from the original French version. I made these copies from the University of Tokyo library copy. I couldn't believe it when I went into the University of Tokyo Library and there was a first edition on the shelf that I could borrow. I just about fell on the ground with surprise when I found this. But anyways, here's some pictures of the scenes that take place in Japan. One of the characters joins a circus and all sorts of funny things happen. But anyway, I hope you read it if you haven't read it before. But as I went through this and kind of dissected the small changes that were made, I found that basically Kawashima had made three major, although it's very faithful in general to the translation, there's some small differences, tweaks that he made to the text. There are three kinds. One of them is a series of corrections to Verne's misrepresentations of Japan. Obviously, Jules Verne never went to Japan. He was reading books. We know which books he read about Japan because we can trace very closely the descriptions of Japan to other books that were published in Switzerland and France at the time. So, but because he was working from other books, he sometimes made mistakes. And so Kawashima always was correcting these mistakes quietly there in his translation. He also made some clarifications to make Jules Verne's attitude towards Japan appear non-judgmental. There's some things that he said that were a little bit provocative and that may have been a bit, made Japanese readers go, so he clarified some of these points. And also, there's a few places where there's language that sounds slightly negative or could be construed as slightly negative, and Kawashima changed those, corrected those. So I'll give you some examples. It's hard to do this because there's a lot of details. I've put the original French on the left and the Japanese on the right. This is written in a form called Kanbun Kundokutai, where he's it's kind of close to what would be Kanbun, the way that Kanbun is read aloud. I was trying to think about how to show this to you easily in a way that would be not so overwhelming. I realized that not everyone speaks French. So what I did was I translated the French and the Kanbun Kundokutai into English so that I could put them side by side. But and I'm not going to go into all the details, but I just want to point out some places that were modified. And so I put the corresponding places, in the same color. One of the things, like in this passage, there's a description of a shrine, a Shinto shrine in Yokohama, a place that Kawashima himself must have known well. But Jules Verne made a number of small mistakes in describing the shrine, and so he corrects them on the right-hand side. For instance, the kinds of trees. He corrects the kinds of trees that are actually at the shrine. He corrects the descriptions of the building itself, and he also corrects an error that Jules Verne made, where he says that at this Shinto shrine, followers of Buddhism and the religion of Confucius gather. That's obviously not correct. That's not what happens at a Shinto shrine. So he corrected that in the Japanese, taking it out completely. So you see that's why it's marked in red at the left. Here's another example. In one place, there's a mention where the character Passepartout arrives in Japan. There's this one line which says, Passepartout made footfall without any enthusiasm on the soil so curious on the children of the sun. If you read the story, you'll know that it's actually a mistake that he arrives there in Japan. And so it's not that this character Passepartout is unhappy to be in Japan. It's just that a series of problems along the way make him land there, take him to there. So this, but apparently, Kawashima didn't like the fact that it mentions that without any enthusiasm he arrived in Japan. So he changed this and added quite a bit and explained why it was that the character was so unhappy to be there. He couldn't help going on land, but because everything that had happened to him since arriving in Hong Kong was as wrong as a crossbill eating with its beak. So in its heart, he was not satisfied and not looking forward to this. So he explained this. When I read this in the Japanese, I'm like, hey, what does that mean? Like a cross bill with its beak? And then I looked it up and I realized that there's a kind of bird called a crossbill that has a beak that looks like this. And so this kind of beak is designed for eating only one kind of food, and it can't eat other kinds of food. It's very good at picking out the seeds of pine needles, pine cones, I guess. But anyway, the point is that like he uses this as a metaphor, and this metaphor doesn't exist in the original at all. So anyway, the point is that he's explaining why these characters are unhappy to be in Japan. But some of the other changes are more telling. The descriptions of the marketplace in Yokohama are very, very interesting. He describes the marketplaces in Japan, and so some of the judgmental language, or maybe actually kind of neutral language, talking about merchants being there to ready to buy up everything. He describes in the Japanese as a market forming an extremely prospering market where everything was being bought and sold, making the kind of Japanese marketplace look much more attractive and kind of, exciting, modern than perhaps it does in the original French. And then there's a mention too at the bottom where Passepartout is feeling alienated, as if he's feeling himself as foreign, as if he has been thrown into a country of Hottentots. The Hottentots are kind of an indigenous people of South Africa. And so I think that probably Kawashima was maybe shocked to find this description of Japanese being, maybe implicitly compared to Africans. And so he explains this away. He says, Passepartout had no one there who he knew, so he felt even stranger, as if he had abruptly come down from the clouds into the Hottentot land of Southern Africa. He kind of tries to explain what is happening here in order so that the Japanese will not be offended. Finally, just two more quick examples. There's a mention in which there is the comparisons between Japan and China, and this obviously would make Japanese readers feel very maybe uncomfortable, or and so these are very interesting moments in the text. In the original French, it says something like, the profession of the soldier is held in as much high esteem as it is downplayed in China. This is when it's translated, he says, it was the custom that people this is probably because in Japan, unlike Qing Dynasty China, it was the custom that people would treat it as an honor to do military service. If we remember that in the Meiji period Japan, creating a strong country with a rich country with a strong military was one of the major goals of the nation. So, it probably was important to Kawashima to emphasize the importance of the strong military. And so this seems to be written here into the text, reflecting those cultural values of the time. Finally, this is my last example. There's a physical comparison of the Japanese and the Chinese. And in the description, there's this very kind of interesting description. He says that the Japanese have smooth hair as black as ebony, big necks, long necks, spindly legs, really tall stature, having colorations from the somber hues of copper to a flat white, but never yellow like those Chinese, from which the Japanese differ in fundamental ways. Not exactly racially flattering. So interestingly, when this is translated into Japanese, there were some changes made. The interesting part, I think, especially is this final one, where he says there is neither a darkened bronze or white, but there's not a single person who had the jaundiced yellow like the people of the Qing nation. The language that Kawashima has used to translate the French, in other words, is extremely prejudicial against the Chinese people. There's no way of seeing this as anything less than racial prejudice. So it's interesting that some of these values that existed in Japan are being written clearly into the text. So what should we take away from all this? If I'm to follow Koyano Atsushi's lead and kind of get away from the kind of small details and kind of pull back to the big picture, this is what I think we should take away. That not only is a translation of Around the World in 80 Days a fascinating study of translation and literary history, it clearly reveals the ways that Japanese writers were reflecting upon their own position in the modern world, especially at a moment when Japan was just moving into the modern world and trying to take its place amongst the advanced nations of the world. He projects an image onto the text comparable with Japan's imperial goal to become a rich country with a strong military, with cultural and physical qualities that would ensue a privileged place in East Asia. Kawashima's translation, I might even go as far as to say, it foreshadows the nationalistic rhetoric that would later recur in the First Sino-Japanese War a little bit more than a decade later. So we see this kind of traces of the nationalism of the Japanese written right here into the text. So the point, again, that I've been making all along is that the translation serves as a vehicle that translators, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, use in promoting their own worldview. So here is one way I think that we can use a really interesting example of a translation, and reading by the details of the translation, find a little piece of cultural history that no one has ever looked at before. Almost every translation, I would argue, we could do the same kind of thing. We can look in and find the values of the people who wrote the text, written into, inscribed into the text at every level in a way that's not very obvious at first reading, but significantly affects the impression that the reader takes away. Let me give you another case example. This is a radically different kind of case study, but I'd like to look at one of the poems from the ancient collection of Japanese poetry called the Hyakunin Nishu, the 100 poets by 100 poems by 100 poets. You know, this is the set of poems that virtually every Japanese person learns in school. I just thought that I would take a look at, I randomly chose one poem in this, in the Hyakunin Nishu, and took a look at lots of different translations of it. And when I did that, I found something really, really interesting and something that surprised me that I wasn't looking for at the beginning. But first of all, let me just show you this this poem. This is poem 17, written by Ariwara no Narihira. And ちはぶる、ちはやぶる、神代も聞かず、立つた川、からくれない、からくれないに、水くくるとは。Joshua Masto has given us a translation unheard of even in the legendary age of awesome gods, Tatsuta River in scarlet and the water flowing underneath it. I'm just showing this not as the example of a perfect translation, but just to show you more or less the content of the poem. When I looked, the earliest translation I've ever been able to find of the Hyakunin Nishu was this one, which was made in 1866, so even before the Meiji Restoration. This was done by a guy by the name of Frederick Victor Dickens, who was a British naval doctor and a lawyer at the UK consulate in Japan. Here's his translation. Oh, Tatsuta, then the autumnal flow I watch of thy deep ruddy wave, e'en when in the stern gods long ago did rule, was ne'er beheld so brave, so fair a stream as thine I vow. I read this and I was like, wow, what the heck, you know? But as I looked at it, I was like, I started counting syllables and looking at the rhyme stream. So I put in red the things that he added. I noticed that, well, so it's a five line poem in a form that is known in English as a quintilla. It's an A, B, A rhyme scheme, flow, ago, I guess, vo, if you read it in a maybe British pronunciation or older pronunciation. So there's a rhyme scheme, wave and brave rhymes. So A, B, A, B, A, and all the lines each have 8 syllables. So this is a recognizable poetic form of the 19th century, a form that people would use to translate to write original poetry in English. So Dickens has used this form in translating the poem. The next translation I was able to find was the one by Basil Chamberlain, a famous British Japanologist and translator. Even when on earth the thundering gods held sway, with such a sight beheld, calm Tatsuta's flood, stained as by Chinese art with hues of blood, rolls o'er Yamato's peaceful fields away. If we look at this again, I put the parts that he sort of added in red in order to, fill out the form. But again, if we look at the form, we see perfect 10 syllables in each line, and an A-B-B-A rhyme scheme. So sway, away, rhyme, flood, blood, rhyme. So if we see this, we immediately recognize this as iambic pentameter. This is a form known as the Italian quatrain, 10 lines written in iambic pentameter, this very ordered form of poetry that, again, was something that that was used very commonly in English poetry in imitation of Italian poetry in the 19th century. Later, the next translation was by Col Macaulay. I have never heard that even when the gods held sway in the ancient days, air was water-bound with red, such as here in Tata's stream. This guy was an American unitary missionary in Japan, and this translation was especially interesting to me because when you look at the patterns, you'll see that there's one rhyme, but it's not organized around rhyme in the same way that the other translations were. But if you count the syllables, you'll see it's 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. So here, this is the first example that I've ever seen of an attempt to imitate the rhythm of the Japanese original in English. And so here we see a different attitude towards translation and what translation should do, rather than trying to put something that's foreign into a recognizable form. It's trying to kind of reproduce that form and introduce something new into the field of poetry itself. Do you know what I mean? To create a new form for us. I'll give you a couple more examples. All red with leaves, Tatsuta streams so softly purls along. The everlasting gods themselves, who judge twixt right and wrong, never heard so sweet a song. Very free translation. He adds things that are not in there at all in the original. But again, he's kind of trying to do something interesting, I guess, with the rhyme scheme. I'm not exactly sure what he was trying to do. It's close to something like an English quintain, maybe an imitation of the Japanese rhythm. I don't know. But anyway, again, we can see that he's moving away from poetic forms, established poetic forms. Here's another interesting example from some years later by a very, very famous American poet by the name of Kenneth Rexroth, who was a modernist and also a lover of Japan. He himself did, with the cooperation of Japanese informants, a number of translations into English. But here this is what he did. Even in the age of the strong, swift gods, I never heard of water like Tatsuta River dyed with blue and Chinese red. He doesn't add very much. But what's interesting is that he kind of turns away from meter and rhyme in the modernist style of the early and mid 20th century. He also seems to be, Kenneth Rexroth was working in the tradition established by Ezra Pound and his other kind of modernist colleagues in using, emphasizing image above meter, rhyme, and other forms. So we see these kind of imagistic tendencies, I think, in this translation. So finally, one last one, and then I'll go to my conclusions for this case study. But here's a translation by a very famous Japanese American translator by the name of Sato Hiroaki. He translated it in a single line. And his logic was that in Japanese, the poems are written in a single line of text. So it's misleading to translate in 5 lines or something like that, or 4 lines, 3 lines, or however many. He believes that a tanka or haiku should be translated in a single line. Unheard of, even in the age of mighty gods, tie-dyeing the waters of Tatsuta River in Korean crimson. So he's trying to reformulate the way that we think about waka. And he's borrowing a form in English called the monostitch, a single line of poetry without any kind of internal rhythm itself. So he's trying to encourage us to think about the form of the lineation, I should say, the lineation of the poem itself. So anyway, the result that I wasn't expecting when I started looking at these different translations was basically when you look at these translations and line them up next to each other, you see in the translations a kind of microcosm of the entire development of 19th and 20th century poetry. As we put them together, this tells us much more about the the ideas on the receiving end about how poetry should be and how those ideas, what poetry looks like, have changed over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So this actually is even more interesting to tell us about the English receiving side than even, you know, and their attitudes towards what poetry should be. As I've just argued, over decades, the fixed, regular, European-derived forms of poetry that were used in the 19th century give way to an attempt to understand poetry on its own terms, especially as the modernist fascination with East Asia takes hold. I think it's interesting that like people like Kenneth Rexroth, you know, modernists were so passionate about East Asia, and therefore, you know, that they wanted to understand Japanese poetry on its own terms. This made me think of something that Lawrence Venuti said. He said that when we're teaching translation and we're teaching a translated text, it's very useful to compare different translations of the same text side by side in the classroom, because that gets students to think about the attitudes and the ideas on the receiving end. He argues a pedagogy of translated literature can help students learn to be both self-critical and critical of the exclusionary cultural ideologies by drawing attention to the situatedness of texts and interpretations. Translations are always intelligible to, if not intentionally made for, specific cultural constituencies at specific historical moments. So in this case, you know, these translations were all done for lovers of poetry in the English-speaking worlds in the 19th and 20th centuries. So they're all speaking to, or trying to speak to, the attitudes that the receiving end held about what good poetry is. So, yeah. So I'll just introduce one final case study, again, a very different kind of case study. I wanted to look a little bit at the translations of Dr. Seuss into Japanese. The reason I got interested in this is because one of my best friends, Ito Hiromi, a writer that I've translated a lot, did a translation of The Cat in the Hat, one of the most famous English language children's books of all time, into Japanese. So I began to get interested and look at the history of Dr. Seuss translations. I'll just mention maybe one translation very quickly because of time. But can I ask how many people have read Dr. Seuss? Some? Okay. Oh, pretty much. Okay. Lots of people have. Okay, that's good. Dr. Seuss is a very famous American children's book author. There was a study published in 2001 that said 14 of the top selling 100 American books of all time were by Dr. Seuss. He's in the year 2001, they estimated that all of his books had sold over 200 million copies, which is a pretty big number. The Dr. Seuss Foundation has guessed or done research that says that 1/4 of all American children receive a Dr. Seuss book as their first book. So this guy's important. I remember, you know, I loved the Dr. Seuss books as a boy, and because they're so rhythmic, fun, quirky, strange, and you know, those are kind of aspects that children love. But one of the reasons that he's also so popular, especially in America, is that he reflects values that I think Americans like to think are kind of quintessential American values, such as democracy, humanism, and anti-racism. You know, these are, I think, part of the sort of American self-mythology about, you know, who we are as a nation, you know, a democratic nation, anti-racist nation, and so on. You know, if you look at the current American administration, you might think otherwise, but you know, you know, I think that this is the view that a lot of Americans want to have of themselves. I should point out that the book that was the first one translated into Japanese was a book called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. And this is a book that actually really surprised me because it's not one of his most famous books in America. I'd never read it, actually. I'd never even heard of it. But this is the first book to be translated into Japanese, and I'll tell you why. But a little bit more background about him. Dr. Seuss came from a German-speaking household. German was his first language, even though he was born in America. He didn't speak English, I guess, until going to school. And then once that was about the time of World War I. And as a German speaker in America in World War I, he was ruthlessly harassed and felt like he received a lot of discrimination. And so this kind of put into his soul a sense that, we need to be kind of an anti-racist, non-discriminatory population. And that is a value that he repeats over and over and over and over in many of his books. But despite this background, there were some moments that were a little bit problematic in his past. After establishing himself as a cartoonist and children's author, he works as a political cartoonist at PM Magazine. And this is exactly the time that World War II breaks out. So as he was working as a political cartoonist, of course, it's impossible to make political cartoons at the time that Japan and America go into war with each other without talking about the war, right? So he created a number of political cartoons that, if we look at now, are obviously very racist, very racist. Even he recognized a few years later that these were terribly racist, and he began to feel awful self-guilt about this. And he spent a lot of time afterward trying to make up for these kind of these racist portrayals of the Japanese at the beginning of World War II. He was actually drafted into the war effort, and he began to work with the American film director Frank Capra to make a series of propaganda films about Japan. One of them was called Know Your Enemy, Japan. You can see already how problematic it is. He made a film that was shown to every occupation force member in 1946 and during the occupation, called Our Job in Japan, telling the American occupying forces what they needed to be doing in Japan and how they needed to influence the Japanese population. What I'm showing you is a still from that movie. At the same time that this image shows on the screen, it says, our problem is this is the text that Dr. Seuss wrote. Our problem's in the brain inside the Japanese head. There's 70 million of these in Japan, physically no different than any other brains in the world, all made of exactly the same stuff. These brains, like our brains, can do good things or bad things, all depending on the kind of ideas that are put inside. So the point is that Dr. Seuss began to believe that giving an education, an anti-racist sort of democratic education to the Japanese was fundamentally important. Interestingly enough, right after this, at the same time that this movie was being shown to every occupation soldier that was going to Japan, the first translation of Dr. Seuss was made into Japanese in 1949. This book called Fushigina Gohyaku no Boshi. It was done by a translator called Omori Takeo. I've never heard of this guy. I couldn't find anything about this person at all, but the translation itself is really fascinating. I just should mention that this original text was published in 1938, soon after the Nazi annexation of Austria and Sudetenland. Because of his own experiences in World War I with anti-German prejudice, Seuss felt it obliged to speak out against Hitler's unjust and arbitrary rule. And so his response was this book. And the book is about a common boy, an ordinary boy in the street, who has a beautiful, cute little hat. And when the king comes to the town, the little boy, he tries to take off his hat, but he finds mysteriously under his hat is another hat. And so he tries to take that one off, but there's another hat inside of that for no reason. And so the king sees this and gets angry and says, well, look at this boy. He hasn't taken off his hat in front of me. I need to punish him. So he takes him and puts him in jail. And Bartholomew is, meanwhile, he's trying to take off his hat, but each time there's another hat underneath it for no reason. This keeps on going over and over and over again. But as he keeps on taking off more and more hats in jail, trying to prove that he's a good subject, the hats underneath become more and more gorgeous until finally the hats are big and beautiful and encrusted with gold and jewels and all sorts of nice things. And at this point, the king begins to become less angry and more jealous. And so what happens, after suffering in jail, Bartholomew decides to give his beautiful golden hats to the king as a crown. And so the king is so grateful that he rewards Bartholomew. But the point of this story is that it's an allegory about sovereignty. What is the rule of the king? Um, the point Dr. Seuss is making is that sovereignty, the right to rule, should be given from the people and not taken by force. And a message that I think that he wished that Hitler would listen to. This translation, when it's translated into Japanese, becomes a bestseller. Judging from the number of copies, of used copies that exist in Japan, it must have been printed over and over again a number of times. I've read one account that said that actually this was required reading for children in occupied Japan. I've not been able to prove that through Japanese sources. I've only read that in American sources. But the point was, it did get read a lot. But this translation was part of a new wave of post-war children's literature that wanted to break with kind of pre-war and wartime past to make, send new messages to children. There are other many examples of children's literature translated at this time that try to create a new literature for children, such as the translations by Ibuse Masuji of Hugh Lofting's Dr. Dolittle books, which were published by Ishii Momoko, the famous Japanese writer who was working at Iwanami at the time. So this is my final point here, but it's interesting to note that just the year before that this was translated, there was a kind of interesting moment in the history of the Japanese imperial institution, in which is called the Humanity Declaration, the Ningen Sengen, which took place on January 1st of 1948. And in this statement that was issued by the emperor, he says that I'm not a god. I'm an ordinary human being like everybody else. And the links between the imperial nation and the people should be formed on mutual trust and admiration rather than a kind of a priori pre-existing superiority of the emperor over the people. And actually, the way that it was reflected in the headlines and in Japan was like this. The rescript presented a bonds of the society should be based on trust, respect between the emperor and the people. So Japan was ready for, and in fact had already started constructing a new vision of the monarchy that relied upon, not upon superiority, but an understanding of the mutually beneficial relationship between the people and the throne. So the fact that this book was translated just very, very, very shortly after this kind of turning point in the history of the imperial monarchy is no coincidence. The translation of this picture book actually is a reflection of this thing, that much bigger thing that is happening in Japanese society. And the book actually serves as a piece of propaganda, I should say, to try to introduce this value to the Japanese population and instill it in the children. So again, my conclusion is that children's literature, which we tend not to study very much, actually contributes a lot to building identity, worldview, and linguistic sensibilities. And the earliest translations of Dr. Seuss, who was wanting to overcome his own anti-racist past while also promoting democratic and humanitarian values in Japan, became a tool to help build a new sense of nationhood in post-war Japanese children. So to kind of generalize, as Venuti has noted, translations are not ideologically neutral vehicles carrying material from the source culture to the target culture. Translators and publishers choose works of literature when they respond to particular, timely, historical desires or needs within the target culture. And the extent to which a translated work responds to those needs helps to determine how successful it is in the marketplace of ideas, and maybe even in the financial marketplace as well. So here, again, I think is one beautiful example of how translation studies can show us a great deal about the history of the time and the place where these things were being translated. So thank you very much.